Okay, last podcast of the day. I know there's been a lot of podcast time, but there's a lot to talk about. So, Japan is moving into China, has already moved into Korea, has already captured Taiwan, or taken over control over Taiwan. Um, and then in the 1930s, the Japanese start being more aggressive in China. Now, here's something you have to realize about Japan. I talked about this in the podcast or in my lecture on Tuesday. There's no one single dictator in Japan. There's no Stalin in Japan. There's no Hitler in Japan, like you have in Soviet Union and Germany. There's no one dictator that we can point to in Japan. What you had in Japan were competing nodes of power. So the Navy was competing with the Army, especially, and then the civilian government. So it's much more confusing in a way than Germany and the Soviet Union because they're fairly simple, although horrific, because Germany and the Soviet Union have an overarching dictator. You don't have that in Japan. What you have in Japan is competing centers of power. And one of these competing centers of power is the army. And the army has gained the upper hand in Japan over the navy, especially because it's the army that occupies China. And this very, very valuable area that Japan wants to exploit its natural resources. I'm talking about Manchuria, that area of China. Japan has an army in Manchuria, making sure that the South Manchurian Railroad runs like it should. It's occupying Korea. And so in the early 1930s, the army is probably the most powerful entity in the national government. So in the early 1930s, the army that was in Japan, the Japanese army that's in Manchuria has gotten frustrated with Tokyo. The Japanese army in Manchuria, the so-called Kwantung army, decides that it wants to force the hand of the civilians in Tokyo and that it wants Tokyo to be forced to maybe capture Manchuria. So what happens is the Japanese army in Manchuria in 1931 fabricates an attack on the railroad, which they were protecting, and it begins to attack Chinese troops in Manchuria. And very quickly, the Japanese army in Manchuria gains control over Manchuria. It actually succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. So the Japanese capture in Manchuria in the early 1930s, it doesn't come from Tokyo. It comes from the army commanders on the spot who are frustrated with the Japanese government and they want to force the hand of the Japanese government. They fabricate an attack, and then the Japanese army takes over Manchuria. And the Japanese civilian government in Tokyo has to go along with this. It can't say no. If it did, its leaders would have been assassinated. Literally, they would have been assassinated. And so the army's sitting pretty. They had staged this kind of coup in Manchuria, forced the hand of their government. Now Japan now gains more or less formal control over Manchuria. Now, let's go back to Chiang Kai-shek. He's not really ready for a war with Japan yet. He's trying to avoid it. And so what happens in Manchuria, it instigates a period in the early 1930s, a period of tension between China and Japan, where Chiang Kai-shek is coming under increased pressure to do something about what the Japanese have done in Manchuria, that they basically have captured Manchuria. But Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader and the recognized leader of China, he doesn't really feel ready to go to war with China yet. He's not strong enough. The communists, as I said in my earlier podcast, they're completely sidelined, right? They had just completed they complete the long march after the Japanese take over Manchuria. So the Chinese communists at this point are at their low point. So they can criticize Chiang Kai-shek, but there's nothing they can do about it. I can't stress enough to you how little fighting in terms of big military campaigns the communists did during World War II against the Japanese. So this is what's happening there's a lot of tension between Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists and the Japanese in Manchuria. There's a lot of tension back and forth. The Japanese, there's some scattered fighting in Manchuria. There's some resistance in Manchuria with that the Japanese put down with just real ruthlessness. And so this is what's building up to the so-called Marco Polo Bridge episode in 1937, which kicks off the war. And I guess so. This is how I'll end the lectures this week. That what happens in 1937 has a long history of the Japanese moving into northern China, especially Manchuria, more or less formally moving into Manchuria, which they called Manchukuo in 1931. Chiang Kai-shek, he doesn't like what's happening in Manchuria. He doesn't feel like there's much he can do about it. He's coming under increased pressure to do something about it. There's some fighting in Manchuria. There's some tension in Manchuria. And all this will explode into a war, it's kind of an accidental war in one sense, that neither the Japanese or Chiang Kai-shek really wanted the war to start at the Marco Polo Bridge in 1937. But in another sense, it's not accidental. It's not accidental at all. There would have been a war between the Chinese and the Japanese. There's just no doubt about it. The Japanese were determined to capture large areas of China, and the Chiang Kai-shek, for all his problems, was determined not to lose territory to the Japanese. It was just a question of when he was going to fight. So there would have been a war between the Japanese and the Chinese. It was just a question of when it would start. But it does start in 1937 as the growing tensions between the Japanese in Manchuria and the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek explode at the Marco Polo Bridge, which is the point that you start your reading.